basically I got so excited about Daggerheart that I reached out to 3 different player groups and went, do you want to play Daggerheart? And they all said yes. So, hello, adventurers. I am the Welsh DM, the one Welshman whose accent got corrupted by delirium in Drakkenheim. And this week I am joined by the incredible Mike Underwood to discuss adventures in Daggerheart, Drakkenheim, and all things Daggerheart as well. At the top, Mike, do you want to take a moment to introduce yourself, where people might have seen your work, and what your connections are to Daggerheart and things?
Yeah, absolutely. It's very fun getting to sit down and chat games and RPGs in Daggerheart again. I am Mike Underwood. I use they and he pronouns. I am probably best known at this point as a additional designer on the Daggerheart core rulebook. I also was a additional designer on the quick start adventure known as Sable with Messengers, lead designer on Marauders of Windfall, which was the 2024 Gen Con adventure that Darrington Press put out, and I was a co-writer on the Daggerheart homebrew kit. Now I am working as lead designer on the Dungeons of Drakkenheim Daggerheart campaign guide, which is currently on Kickstarter as of right now when we're recording.
As you said, you were additional designer on Daggerheart, and have been a wonderful person within the community on places like Blue Sky and all of that with Daggerheart, as people have kind of got to grips with the games as well. I personally think Daggerheart adds a incredibly fresh take on the conventional kind of heroic fantasy TTRPG space that we've kind of been enthralled in the D20 system for the better part of half a century, it feels like at times. Kind of adapting the genre to modern TTRPG usage, where it's no longer necessarily hack and slash dungeon crawling, although many people still get the fun out of that, but instead we've moved it into this ability to tell dramatic stories with our friends. So I'm wondering from your kind of much closer touch with it, what do you think sets Daggerheart apart from other heroic fantasy TTRPGs?
Yeah, I think for me, there's a bunch of stuff. The ones that really come to mind the most are, and you see this in the Daggerheart core rulebook, right? If we look at the touchstones and acknowledgements page, there are a ton of different TTRPGs that are referenced, and a goodly number of them, there are specific references to elements in different games that the team drew inspiration from in creating the game. And so for me, one of the big things that Daggerheart does is it looks pretty broadly at 15 to 20 years of TTRPG design, especially in the kind of, if I'm going to get more technical here, Forge and post-Forge diaspora, specifically the story game movement, and then design traditions, including Power by the Apocalypse and Forged in the Dark, and tries to take lessons and learn from a bunch of those games and then synthesize what those games have to offer and the ways that they approach things like non-binary result states and kind of systemization of complicated obstacles through like a clocks system as refined in Blades in the Dark, which then shows up in Daggerheart as the countdown system. And so it's what happens if you make a fantasy adventure game with a design team that has this really broad and deep knowledge and love of a bunch of different design approaches, and you bring that to a game that tries to straddle the middle ground between a trad, somewhat more combat-focused fantasy action game in the mode of a D&D 5e or a Pathfinder 2nd edition or some other games in those along those lines, combining that with something more like a Power by the Apocalypse game or something in the story game tradition where we're using GM principles and best practices a la play to find out and hold on gently and draw maps but leave blank spaces. That approach where not just play but design philosophy is articulated more transparently, where the game will say, this is what this game is, here's what it's trying to do, here's how you do that so that you can get the most out of this game based on how we have built it for you to play.
You said something there that really struck home with me with how Daggerheart was written compared to other rulebooks that I've read that tend to be quite matter of fact with its mechanics. It's just like, these are the mechanics, this is how the game plays, off you go. Daggerheart in its writing is much more conversational when you're reading the rulebook, of going like, here's the mechanic, this is trying to do this, can be used in this way. And it really puts me as the GM primarily, and players when they read it in that frame of reference of, oh, okay, that's what this mechanic is trying to do. I can let it do that, and then I can go and have fun doing all the creative, crazy stuff that players love to do.
For me, in that like conversationality and intentionality, I could easily draw a line of like game design lineage or ancestry through to at least something like Apocalypse World by Vincent Baker and Magai Baker, which is also actually crowdfunding right now for a new edition, Burned Over. There's big chunks of the writing that is addressing the GM or addressing the players really explicitly and doing everything possible to, rather than make the game seem like it is this kind of seamless, perfect object that you just receive and have to like use as is, more kind of showing you the seams, opening things up so that you can understand how the mechanisms fit together, such that when you play a game, there's a certain degree to which you're inevitably going to change it through interpretation or homebrewing or hacking, however you want to talk about it. But there's at least one, and probably others, but I see one major tradition that informs Daggerheart where more of this design approach is made transparent. And I think part of how that is done is in that conversationality, so that when we get to Daggerheart, there are sections that are basically, this is what you do, and here is why, or here's what we're going for, and here's what that does, so that there's some dimension or context that's given for what you're trying to do.
One thing that I noticed when I started playing Daggerheart during the beta testing, essentially, and I said this in one of my first videos on the matter, was I came away from Daggerheart with my most simple explanation to players who are switching to it from a Pathfinder, a D&D, was where Pathfinder, D&D, those kind of classic games, the GM is often the one putting the story or pulling the players through the story, essentially. There's a rope that they've got tied around the players and they're going, come on, further into the dungeon, off we go, and then you can deal with the obstacles that I pull you into. I felt very much that Daggerheart was more player-driven, and the GM is just almost that Wallace and Gromit meme of just throwing out things as the players are this train just barreling down the tracks, which can take a little bit of getting used to, especially for people who've only ever played D&D. But I've found it as a GM very freeing, where I'm just like, I really don't have to prep. I just have to have a concept of where I want the story to go, and then I've got enough like bends in my track to get people going the right kind of direction, but then they're off the chain and very quickly doing things that they find fun, what they find interesting about the world that we've all kind of built together.
I think a thing about Daggerheart that can be either confusing or it can lead people to need to find out more in terms of trying to differentiate it from other games is that there is a GMing approach and like a style that Daggerheart writes specifically toward. For me, Daggerheart is designed specifically toward that collaboration, and that if we're finding or trying to identify a difference between it and other games in the overall like fantasy adventure genre, it's that focus on and ways that it facilitates the shared storytelling element and a kind of a looser, more improvisational approach. As you were describing kind of the different GMing styles, the metaphor or the image that came to mind for me is kind of like a tour guide with a light, right? And they're going along with you, and you've paid the tour guide for the time, but you're just kind of exploring the space, and they say, oh, well, what about that over here? And you have that communication loop where the GM might hold the light up and point it somewhere, and then talk a little bit about like, oh, and here we can see this, but then they're asking, what else here is interesting to you? And so that the conversation is not only, here is what you see, here is a challenge, how do you respond? And then the GM will say, based on your response and based on the dice, this is what happens. The conversation bounces back and forth, and Daggerheart invites us to, and for me, I especially want to embrace the parts of the game where you throw it to the players in terms of, well, what here is interesting, or like, what do you see in this graveyard at night that makes you worried something supernatural is going on? And if I ask that question of a player, I'm probably doing that knowing that I might have some stuff in prep, or going, I'm just going to take
Hmm.
whatever they give me, and that's going to be the thing for this scene. If you want to play in that looser mode, a lot of the game will support it, and there's specific mechanical elements that use loops along those lines. One of my favorite abilities in the game is a soldier's bond, which is a blade domain
Yeah.
ability that says complement another player character, right? Basically, if you do a little bit of role play, here's the mechanical bonus that you get. And
Yeah.
it creates those tight loops of add to the story, have interaction, and then you get a mechanical output which powers further play.
I entirely agree with you. I love that Daggerheart really trusts the people playing the game to play it earnestly. I've seen various people online say like that Soldier's Bond thing is just like, well, why don't I could just say you're a good guy and I get the bonus. Like, yeah, you could, but the game is expecting you to buy in, which I think is it's very enjoyable to have a game that just trusts the people playing the game to play it the way they want to play it, and it's just sitting there to give you the tools to do so. Well, clearly you love Daggerheart nearly as much as I do. Um, and among many incredible projects that you're working on, that if people aren't aware, Mike does have his own YouTube channel, own Twitch stream. Do go follow those to kind of see everything that they're working on over there. But you are, as you said, leading the Dungeons of Drakkenheim adventure campaign setting being ported over to Daggerheart in a kind of design capacity. How are you finding it? What's it like taking something that the TTRPG D&D internet has made into quite an iconic setting that a lot of people have played in? What's it like moving that over to a new system? What makes Drakkenheim like the perfect Daggerheart adventure?
Like, first off, working with the Dungeon Dudes and Ghostfire Gaming has been an absolute delight. And we've had the fortune of kind of building to a official partnership with Darrington Press. I played an 80 something session campaign of Dungeons of Drakkenheim in 5e, right? So I've played through the whole module. The way that Dungeons of Drakkenheim works, there is almost the expectation that your version of the campaign is going to be really different than other people's, because it has that sandbox player driven quality, which is like the first of several things I think that makes it a really good match for Daggerheart in terms of style and approach. So I'd done that, and then the winter between the open beta and Daggerheart's release, I wrote some stuff on my Patreon, first talking about trying to develop an approach to Daggerheart adventure design. But the second thing that I did in pursuit of that was take Dungeons of Drakkenheim as a case study of, okay, if we're going to do this type of adventure design where we're trying to provide tools to link the player characters more closely to the setting and the premise of the adventure, well, Drakkenheim kind of already does that. And I talked about the custom backgrounds that are in the book, as well as the personal quests element,
Yeah.
where the Dungeon Dudes were already doing some of these things that I think will be core for how I want to approach Daggerheart adventure design. And so it made for a really great example there. And then several months later, when the Dungeon Dudes were pondering the question of whether they wanted to reinterpret Drakkenheim in Daggerheart, because they had kind of just started getting into Daggerheart, they found out that not only had one of the game's designers, right, me as an additional designer, played a Drakkenheim campaign, but then wrote about why they thought it was a good match. And that led to Ghostfire reaching out and getting this whole ball rolling.
Incredible.
So I'm, one, very glad that I played in that campaign because it was a bunch of fun. And two, it's then led me to this great opportunity, which is in a lot of ways a continuation of what I was doing on like stream and with my own like third party stuff using the community gaming license, but at this bigger scale with new partnerships and getting to take on this larger responsibility in stepping up as lead designer.
I don't want to stick on Drakkenheim too much because as I'm just going to point people to your channel again because I think you did was it last week's stream, an incredible breakdown of the campaign frame there.
Oh,
I
thank you.
particularly love the corruption system in there, the kind of delirium effect there with hope and everything like that. I think one of the strengths of Daggerheart is going to have in this space of not just porting systems over, but in creating unique worlds that people are going to want to explore and take adventures in, is you have so many of these dials that you can twist, you can manipulate, you can change, that because Daggerheart is built in a fairly robust way, that means you can't really break a system, like with HP, with the threshold and that kind of thing. You can really get quite inventive with these different dials to see how they play out and invoke the kind of setting sense that you want to get across.
The corruption mechanics that we came to in the frame were very much like an active back and forth conversation with the dungeon dudes, where they'd already had some thoughts about how they might want to approach contamination, coming from how they'd done it in D&D, and then looking at and really being taken by the game putting theme front and center in terms of this is a game about hope and fear, right? You have dice that are representing that duality between hope and fear. But in a couple of back and forths, we got to the point of, oh, well, if contamination crosses off your hope slots and if mutations give you abilities, it creates this turning point where at 4 contamination or more, you can't use your hope feature anymore. Your class hope feature, which costs 3 hope. Because if you cannot hold 3 hope, you cannot spend 3 hope. But at that 4 contamination, the second feature in mutations becomes available. And the way that I framed it was, when you lose your hope feature, you gain a fear feature on the mutation. And that just gave it a really great sense of like synchronicity or balance or symmetry, so that, oh, okay, you're losing hope, and what do you have to call upon? It's just fear. And that can not necessarily create more of a feedback loop or like a death spiral, but it shows that tipping point toward fear dominating.
I think it's going to be really great fun to play with. I look forward to seeing what more creative things come out of the Drakkenheim Kickstarter. I don't need to promo the Kickstarter, it's already well above threshold, but there will be a link in the description below to connect to it. Do go check it out. Grab the campaign frame for free, even if you don't back it, and check out Mike's incredible work there. I've backed it. This isn't promo. This isn't sponsored. I just like things and want people to get them too.
Yeah, and I'll make a fairly soft pitch to folks that are watching. If you're excited about more different approaches to and bigger company support of Daggerheart, I can almost guarantee you that other companies in the fantasy RPG space are watching this Kickstarter to see how well it does. I am hoping to build this book with Ghostfire and the Dungeon Dudes and so on in such a way that there's going to be fun stuff that you can use, even if you're not running a game in Drakkenheim. I would bet that a lot of the adversaries we make would end up being really useful in, I don't know, Age of Umbra.
I think there's a lot of excitement to come in Daggerheart design for world building that is going to come off the back of the Dungeon Dudes and Ghostfire Gaming and yourself diving in and being the first to kind of step out into the wilderness.
Yeah, and I remember Spencer Stark, lead designer of Daggerheart, saying this in at least the AMA last week with the Dungeon Dudes and other times before. There's a lot of excitement from him, and I think more broadly from Darrington as a company, in seeing people make the game their own, not just on the individual table level of, oh, here's the story we told together and how we kind of shared narrative authority, but building a game that then has that openness to other people doing their own design work with it. And I've certainly found that kind of with my Drakkenheim lead designer hat on, like, oh, okay, here's the places where I can dig in. And then I, as a player of Daggerheart, am really excited to see what other people are doing, like what you and your comrades were doing with Wondrous Environments and what other folks are doing in individual works and in bigger projects.
I mean, that's a great segue onto the main topic of what we wanted to chat for today about designing in Daggerheart, but specifically designing adventures in Daggerheart. It is possibly the one thing we haven't seen yet from Darrington Press that I think people want to see from, like, not necessarily the official team, but from talented designers, trusted ones. You're obviously working on Drakkenheim, which kind of bakes in how to do adventures. In that, you've been working on your own adventures with your own streams for a short while now. I suppose, what do you expect to see in adventures in Daggerheart? How are they going to be different from the kind of 200-page hardbacks that you saw in D&D and the adventure paths from Pathfinder? What is Daggerheart going to do differently with adventures that will let it shine as a system?
Yeah, this is a thing I spend a lot of time thinking about and am currently spending a lot of time thinking about because, as you said, there hasn't been a multi-hundred page Daggerheart adventure published yet. The big thing that I want to say is there probably is not one correct answer. There are hopefully a bunch of different correct answers where people can design for either particular audiences or design modules that would support them in the way that they want to play, and then put it out and see if other people connect with it in that same fashion. Where I know that there are people who have just taken already published adventure books, right? The big full adventure books, and are live adapting them Daggerheart through play and prep. They're engaging with something that's pretty thoroughly rounded out
Mm-hmm.
in a lot of these cases, and then drawing from it as they see fit for Daggerheart. And then I think we're also going to see people looking for and building on really loose structures, whether they are going to OSR or NSR, that being old school Renaissance or new school Revolution, where in that design tradition, as I understand it, not having engaged with it much, there's a lot of like procedural generation and charts and tables where people use those as prompts and inspiration and then build on it. And I think there's an overlap in utility between how OSR games often use that material and what you could do with it in Daggerheart, where if I've got a table that's for like travel in a Witherwild campaign, and I go, okay, cool, it's going to be 3 days to get from this town to this other town, and then I roll on some charts, and I use those just as like something to spitball and get rolling, and then I take that idea and I adapt it into the form and the presentation of Daggerheart. So I think those are the two extremes of what we may see. The direction I'm leaning toward in my own personal work, and I think that's informing Daggerheart, or informing the Drakkenheim material, though it's still very much in process. And so anything I say today might be completely different tomorrow or a week from now. The thing I'm trying to go for in my own stuff that I think is a great way to do adventures for Daggerheart is to provide a lot of resources in terms of situations, obstacles, and prompts for players, where in a Witherwild adventure I've been working on, it's okay, you arrive at this town. This town has a particular problem. How do we set that up? Okay, there is some introductory text, and then there's a paint the scene prompt. Paint the scene being a technique created by Jason Cordova, who's the designer of Trophy Gold and Brindlewood Bay and a number of other games, where you ask a question to the party or to the group, and then you invite them to answer in a way that fills out the scene, right? It paints the scene. So as you arrive in this town, you can see that there's a bunch of guards and a bunch of peasants, and the peasants are all farming this lily that is the cure to the disease in the Witherwild. Let's paint the scene. How can we tell that these guards are not here to keep the peasants safe, but to keep them from leaving, right? And that there's not one answer to that. The answer could be, we see that there are bruises on some of the commoners that are obviously not caused by monsters. And then somebody else says, oh, well, all the guards are looking inward. They're not looking outward. They're watching the people, not the wood line. Mm-hmm. But everybody gets to add their own answer. And we use those answers combined to deepen and broaden our understanding of the scene. That way, the GM's text box to introduce the scene might only be like 2 or 3 sentences. And then they are opening up the conversation so that everybody is building the scene. And now we have a broader shared understanding and everyone is bought in on the scene more. Then you can move forward to whatever the obstacles or challenges are, because there's been this effort around the table to really dig into and intellectually as well as emotionally invest in the scene. So you can go from that into, great, and here is the environment stat block for when the guards at the gate interrogate you asking about why you're here before they let you in. And then there's countdowns about trying to convince them before you test their patience.
Yeah.
And the patience runs out.
But no, that sparked a thought in me, because I've had my own thoughts on like what would need to be included from the GM's side on them, but I hadn't considered that aspect of like what boxed text would look like in a Daggerheart. Because you're right, like classic games, the DM sits there, narrates what's happening, here's the obstacle, solve it. Well, with Daggerheart, we want that collaborative world building. We want the players to add into what's going on to spark not only themselves, but the GM. And that's a great way of doing it. If the GM's just got this short prompt and then it's into question and answer time and build that scene. One thing that I'd been thinking about with adventure design specifically is because we've got this brilliant resource in fear for GMs, and something I've been discussing on the subreddit recently about how and when to use that fear. Fear, I feel anyway, in Daggerheart is essentially a justification for a GM to GM and like create problems. I've always felt it, or I did in my early days, felt a little guilt as a GM of going, here's a problem that you didn't see coming because I've just decided it's there. I think it would be really good for adventures where we're establishing these scenes in much more of a kind of movie script way, perhaps, of giving GMs just like ideas of what obstacles, what fear could be spent for that's narratively relevant for this scene, that kind of backs onto the GM moves that you find in the core rulebook, but just makes it a bit more specific to the scene that they're coming from. And then you can kind of connect it into player backstories, and you go, think about how this pit, like, one idea I had for a scene where players go to a noble ball, where you can use the royal advisor, social stat block and all that, is just having fear prompts like an NPC from one of the characters' backstory walks into the party unannounced, or the PCs stumble into a waiter and cause the champagne flute tower to fall over. Like those kind of ones that are quite narratively specific, but invite the players in to add to why it's a problem.
A thing I would add on to that is inviting folks that are watching and listening to go and look at the environment stat blocks in the core book and then in supplements, and just think about those as potential additional GM moves, right? You can pull a GM move from anywhere. You know, there's some moves at the baronial court environment that you could steal into there. It's just an extra menu. And I really like the idea of, with a given scene or with, you know, an obstacle, including some notes that are, here's some extra prompts or ideas for fear moves. In one approach, we might just present those in an environment stat block, but I think it's also viable and maybe more efficient word count wise to just have those really small, short, punchy, almost like bullet list versions of, cool, here's 5 GM moves, and it only takes up 5 lines on your page, as opposed to something that's a little bit more unpacked in the natural language that a lot of the Daggerheart stat blocks are written in, because sometimes you want a little bit more context or something that's a little bit more fleshed out, or you want those prompt questions that come with environments, or you just want, oh, absolutely, I should have somebody get food spilled on them. Right? That's a wonderful fear move.
You were speaking about environments there that made me think an aspect of one of my favorite things. As I said, I did a video on this channel about how Daggerheart solved exploration. I think what it did is it reminded people that there are stories in social and exploration in fantasy, heroic fantasy, TTRPGs. I am the biggest fan of exploration as a pillar. You can ask anyone I've designed with, it's the number one thing I care about. And I'm already thinking about those kind of like adventures that can happen. But I think the environments specifying that this is social, this is environment, it reminds us that we can do adventures that are focused on those kind of pillars. And we don't have to make it a story about going and slaying the dragon or defeating the necromancer's undead army. It can be about a mysterious island has appeared off the coast of your great kingdom. You are the people who've been sent there to explore it. What do you find? What wonders, treasures, other cultures do you find? And what's the story that you tell within that as people exploring a world? Or, as we've seen coming, I think it was teased at Gen Con, where they're doing the campaign frame, which is all about romantasy and all that.
Yeah.
You're going to have adventures that are purely focused on the social. Maybe you have a duel over the heart of a lover, but that's probably the extent of the combat that you're going to see. And I'm very excited to see how those adventures come together using the environment stat blocks that you've mentioned and using the kind of fear prompts that we've talked about.
Yeah, because if we look at some of the root narratives of the fantasy tradition that kind of becomes exemplified by D&D, if we go back to Lord of the Rings, okay, great. We're trying to go over Caradhras. That's a traversal and exploration type of sequence. Great. I spend 4 fear. We cut away to Saruman atop of his tower as he's conjuring this blizzard, and that is what is pummeling you. I'm going to need everybody to make a strength reaction roll as you are, despite the fact that you're bundled up, freezing. And Legolas is like, oh, well, I have an ancestry feature that means that I'm immune to this because elves are OP.
Yep.
But the hobbits are having a really hard time, right? And that's a fear move where you get to personalize the antagonism, but the core of the scene is, can we make it from point A to point B, because that assists our overall goal? And then we have this interaction and role play about which way do we go. And then they go to Moria. They have to open the door, and they have the monster in the water. That these exploration and traversal scenes, not only do they create additional context if you want to add combat, but having a multimodal or multi-directional set of antagonism or like vectors of threat or challenge give a scene dimension, but it also will let different characters shine in different ways. Right? Okay, we've got your guardian is holding off the monster at the gate while your wizard and your bard are trying to figure out the magic lock on the door. Thinking about those different dimensions and different aspects give you the chance to play into or to shine spotlight on characters with different focuses.
But you said something there that reminded me that I think Daggerheart does really quite well. The Witcher RPG took this quite bold approach of having the classes be very good at particular pillars and very bad at other ones. Like, is it the Bard? I think it's called the Bard class in Witcher is incredible at social and absolutely useless in any kind of monster fight. And I think Daggerheart does that in a like slightly softer way. It's not that the Bard in Daggerheart is incapable in combat, but a lot of their features are for those social encounters, for tricking people with words or emboldening people. And that scene that you kind of reimagine, the Watcher in the Water scene at the doors of Durin in Lord of the Rings, just invokes that of like, you can have the Codex wizards who's sitting there studying, going, what's the puzzle, while other people are fighting. And Daggerheart enables that all happening in the same scene without creating any disjoint between what people are doing per se. And I think that is something that designers, when it comes to writing adventures, can really explore and exploit with Daggerheart, of having these kind of complex scenes that allow different people to shine. And in fact, that might be where your concept of these like roles in the adventure that you've included in the campaign frame and spoken about elsewhere come into this kind of adventure design, of you can design specific things in scenes that different character concepts are going to shine in.
Yeah, right. The archetypes framework, that is designed toward the idea of being able to create this really high level of buy-in and be able to customize material to the characters in your party, which can show up in that fashion, right? And that because Daggerheart is unimodal, right, has one mode of play, we don't have a separate mode of combat and interaction or combat versus exploration. We can spend 5 minutes on a couple of action rolls with the characters that are trying to open the door, and then go back to do a bit of combat. And the pacing is narrative pacing instead of like really strict, oh, well, you can only do 6 seconds worth of brainstorming because that's we have a 6-second turn. And it's that structure is designed toward a particular intent, but Daggerheart is not built toward that intent. And so it takes this different approach that is a little bit looser and is more built for people who are telling a story together, right? Yeah. Beat by beat. The amount to which a spotlight and a story beat overlap, for me, is often pretty near total. And that you might get multiple beats with a character, or you might get a couple of action rolls that all add up to one beat, because you're at one place, you make an action that sets you up to then do something that changes the state of the scene, and that's your beat, and that gives you the impetus to jump elsewhere, or point the spotlight, or ask, okay, given that, who's going to jump in, and then someone will build on it. Keeping that looseness in mind, I think, is going to be really handy for adventure designers. And to go back to a point you made, having scenes and situations where there's more than one thing going on, right? It's not just there are monsters here, but there are monsters here, and they specifically don't want you to remove the crystal that will let you open the door, because the crystal being where it is what keeps it warm inside, and those monsters need that warmth to not die. And so they have specific motivation to keep you from doing the thing that will let you advance, and you have to do two things: get the crystal out of the spot to be able to move forward and not get eaten.
I want to circle back to the original conversation we were having about the traversal across the mountain concept. And this is a conversation we very briefly had elsewhere about the streams and pools method of adventure design and almost like campaign writing to an extent that I've seen talked generally in adventure design, but I think a lot of people might find value for with Daggerheart, especially, where the pools and streams, I'm going to explain this really poorly, so if you're in the comments, feel free to correct me. Basically, it takes this premise of it's kind of closed off sandbox adventures where you have like interval sandbox moments connected by these tight bits of linear progression that the GM, for lack of a better term, railroads you through. So you're at a point, you start the adventure, the plot hook happens, you're dragged along a rapids all the way to the next point where you're in a bit of a, to use the Lord of the Rings analogy, you're dragged through to Rivendell, and then it's the choice of, well, which way do we go? Well, we're going to try the mountain pass, that doesn't work. We're then into Moria, we're exploring all of this. And then the next thing is the Ammon Hen happens. That is a fast-paced, dramatic moment that the GM drags you along, and then that causes fractures. And it's having that opportunity to go, well, for some bits of this adventure, we need the GM to take a little bit of control to push the story forward to its eventual conclusion. But we want these areas where the players can add to the world, discover the world, shape the destiny of the adventure. That while there might be 3 rivers branching off this one pool, the GM knows about those 3 rivers, and the player's choices might shape them slightly or push them to the direction of a certain river that then will connect them onto later points.
Yeah, that's really cool, because when you mentioned streams and pools, I had not heard about that framework at all. Hearing you describe it now, it reminds me in some ways of the diamond design structure that I hear people in the interactive fiction world talk about, right? In interactive fiction, you have to detail the individual options because of the format that you're working in versus TTRPGs, which can be more open and flexible and organic. We have the start of what would be a pool, right? You land here and you get a bunch of explanation, and you can go a lot of different directions, but then it comes back to, and now that you've dealt with this, now that you've kind of made your way through the pool, you go through this stream to the next pool. If what you're doing in the pools can lock off one stream and then open another, you get more flexibility, but still within a more bounded structure, as opposed to needing the thing that can happen otherwise in that type of design style is you get exponential route fatigue, where it's like, great, I have to write 16 options for what can happen from here. And if you're trying to do that with an adventure, you're just going to you're going to only have breadth and not depth.
No, I think you're entirely right there. I think where that's where you can connect into concepts like the factions of the world, where the choices the players make with the factions in that pool shapes what direction they can take. To use Drakkenheim, that pool, you talk to Church of the Falling Fire, the Silver Order, whoever you kind of interact with more or side with cuts off a certain avenue. You now can't work with the Silver Order because you're working with the Church of the Falling Fire.
That makes me think of another part of adventure design that I'm excited about in Drakkenheim for sure, that while your characters are acting, the world should be alive, right? Other things should be carrying on. And in this, I am most inspired by the fronts system from Apocalypse World, which then manifests as dungeon fronts in Dungeon World, which is another landmark powered by the Apocalypse game. You can conceive of antagonists or threats as almost like a storm front, right? That's coming in toward where your group is. For a game like Drakkenheim, or if you're running like Five Banners Burning, each of these factions has their own agendas, and those are going to be ticking over with a countdown or with some other way. And building those structures can let your GM track those other elements that are happening off screen without having to maintain a huge amount of like cognitive load, so that your characters can carry on. And then when you hit that point of goal, now you're going to go down to stream, you could have something that comes in and says, based on where they are, what basically actions with regards to factions, this stream is locked, this stream is open, right? To just kind of reframe what you'd talk about. You can use that to then say, okay, based on what they've done with factions, when they get to this next pool that is where they're going already, here's what's waiting for them, because this faction has been doing something while you've been elsewhere.
We're fast running out of time, and I want to get your thoughts on campaign frames. Campaign frames, I think when they came out, opened a lot of people's eyes to a concept that probably not most people hadn't seen before. I know I hadn't seen before, for certain. I love them. I think they helped me as a GM present to my players what I wanted the campaign to be. A brilliant, like, start of a session 0, here you go, this is what to expect kind of thing. But I am now curious as to how it will play, or how other people will see it play with adventures, and whether they kind of go hand in hand, whether they serve completely different purposes. Obviously with Drakkenheim, you've released a campaign frame, and then it's going to be it's not strictly a classic adventure book, but it is like a here's how to run an adventure in Drakkenheim. Is that how you kind of foresee campaign frames working with adventures in the future, or do you think it could be a smorgasbord of options?
I think that people making longer adventures are probably well served by keeping some of the parts from a campaign frame, if not all of them. What a campaign frame can do is give you almost like minimum viable setup. Another metaphor I use for campaign frames is that they're like a sourdough starter, right? They have some character to them on their own, but only by adding to them are you going to get the kind of end product, right? You don't eat the sourdough starter, you use it and work with it and then pull something out to bake, and then you eat that thing. Apologies to all the bakers to whom I'm offending by misunderstanding things. With the frames, some of the stuff is, here's some material so you don't need 100 pages of gazetteer, right? This is enough to jump forward or to build on. And that part of, for me, why frames are really concise is that then everything else is left to your group. For me, in my own playstyle, right, ideally it's stuff that you're building together. If you've got a 200-something adventure book, what's the role of a campaign frame there? I think there's still some elements of what a campaign frame does that I would probably want to have in a large adventure book, which is specifically the setup and pitch for what fun you're then going to have. Because in the core book, each of the campaign frames is giving you a world and setting up, this is what a campaign here is going to be like. Mm-hmm. And of those 6, maybe the clearest example is Colossus of the Drylands, because not only does it introduce a setting, it gives probably the most explicit structure of what your campaign is going to be like. Right? Here is the cycle of play from your kind of downtime-ish mode into hunting a Colossus, fighting a Colossus. You level up, you have downtime, but then also there's the campaign countdown for Kudamat in terms of Kudamat gathering power. So you have a short-term structure cycle, you have the long-term structure cycle, and you have the idea that when you beat a Colossus, you level up. And so that gives you the pacing in terms of your progression. That is a lot of really specific guidance that is about less the setting and more, this is what the play experience and the cycle of arcs and advancement are going to be like. And so I could see a campaign frame in a larger book focus more on those structural elements in terms of promising a play experience, and then letting the setting elements be expressed in a more expansive or exhaustive or completist fashion in the rest of that material.
That's struck a thought in my head of perhaps how I could see them being used. Is it almost, the campaign frame almost acts as the first chapter? This is the setting, this is what to expect from this adventure, this is the GM and player principles, I think, belong in every adventure to an extent of like, this is how to buy in, this is how to get the most out of this. and then you can roll on. And you can even do it with the campaign setting books if they make them. Like, chapter 1, right, read this, then you know whether this is right for you. And then you can read on and read the Gazetteer and read the specific ancestries that are in this world, the specific domains that are in this world, etc. I'm going to steal a little bit from what the work that you're doing on this. You've spoken about your Bastion of Hope kind of campaign frame and the adventures within it. I wonder whether something that interests me perhaps is building out a campaign frame that acts as almost like a hub point, and then you have spokes that are individual short modules and adventures that you can do a range of them. You can get one per level or a couple per tier kind of thing, that you go, here's our campaign frame that our campaign for the next year is going to sit in, that you guys can help us build out during a session 0 and everything. And then GMs just have a dozen adventures to pick from to put their players through that each only last a couple of sessions, and then they come back and assess where they want to go next. It's almost a halfway house to a West Marches campaign.
I really like this because it lets you keep the concise structure and scope of a campaign frame, where if you hand a player a 16-page PDF for the campaign frame, the barrier to entry there is much, much lower than here's 100 pages on this setting and all of the player options. And, but if you can operate within that more modular structure, a campaign frame that sets you up so that you can imagine what it's like if you go do this thing, if you go do that thing, if you go do some other thing, that becomes a lot more digestible. Mm-hmm. Because then I'm reminded here of the designer Spencer Campbell, who has done a fair bit of like episodic design and publication of works, where he'll put out like an initial book, and then here's a supplement, and it's more like a seasonal model. Mm-hmm. As opposed to here's a 300-page book. It's a little more serial. And what that can do for adventure design is it means you don't have to feel like you're building a 300-page book. It can be, well, I have an idea for, let's say, the Witherwild campaign frame, because that one is within the SRD, and so you can publish for it using the CGL, where it's like, oh, okay, here's this one little part of the frame that I'm excited about, and I only have to build around that, because there's already a foundation that I can connect with, where I'm not starting from zero, nor am I having to fill things out in this really big fashion. And a well-designed and expressed frame for me is really clear about what it offers to you in terms of a thematic palette and setting elements and things like that, which then give you more material to work with to go off and build other stuff.
Yeah, I think that's a genius idea. Something to potentially remind Ghostfire, if they're watching for no reason at all. Ghostfire, for a period, did serialized adventures. The Fables, was it? Citadel of the Unseen Sun, that is sitting there. I think that's a great thing. Like, you could do a serialized adventure off of a campaign frame, as you say, like Witherwild, that is much more digestible. And then you can just build on it and go, well, if you played that, you can roll into this, or you can start from here. And it becomes that much more adaptable form of campaigns that I think a lot of people are crying out for in TTRPGs. Like, the odds of your campaign lasting 5 years and doing a great long thing is very small. But your odds of getting your friends together for half a year to play every other week, pretty good.
I mean, I want to see what your hub and spoke adventure and what the design approach for here's a frame and here's adventures that connect to it in different ways. I want to see what that looks like, because that's different than the kinds of stuff that I'm working on now, where Daggerheart is, or where Drakkenheim is. In some ways, you could just think about it as a whole a city that's a dungeon, right? Yes. The whole city is a dungeon, right? And so it's the sandbox mode as opposed to a hub and spoke mode. So, right, that's the thing that I throw to you as the hopeful future fan, so that I can engage with the thing that you're working on.
Well, I know what 2026 has in store for me now, then. Great. That has been wonderful chatting with you, Mike. Thoroughly enjoyable discussion that I think we both could go on for another hour, but I think we both have things to do, and I have to go to bed because I have other things to do in the morning. And you probably need to get back to writing Drakkenheim adventures. So I'll let you go talk to the Canadians. But as I say, this has been wonderful. To close things off, as always, until we do this again, to all of you watching out there, you keep an eye out for dragons. I'm going to go see whether I can complete an adventure to get my accent back. And remember to keep telling stories.